Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. In this video, I will try to help you answer the question of whether or not you should invest into your Windblume Ode. The Windblume Ode is the current event weapon that everyone can get by participating in the event. You will also be able to get it to Refinement 5 as well. I guess the main question in this video isn't whether or not you should get it and get it to Refinement 5, but if you should actually level it up. I'm going to divide this video into two main categories. The first one is for support characters like Venti and Fischl. The second category is for main DPS characters like Ganyu and Childe. Starting off with Venti, let's see how my current level 90 Windblume Ode at Refinement 2 compares to the Skyward Harp at Refinement 1, and also to the Elegy for the End at Refinement 3. I assure you that 3 additional refinements on the Windblume Ode will barely make a difference, more or less completely change the conclusions from this video. Keep in mind that because Windblume requires you to use his skill and then his burst, I did that for all 3 of the weapons against the robots. In the end, the damage against these robots are very similar across the board. Frankly, it's pretty hard to see the damage difference between them. Let's try this again on lower HP targets, this time against more mobs in the Viridescent Veneer dungeon. I think the Skyward Harp did a bit more damage than the other 2 bows, but again, this is another situation where the damage difference between these bows is quite small. Here I did some calculations for Venti. Now there are a ton of assumptions being made here and the math is far from perfect due to the complexity of Venti's burst, but if you want to know all the assumptions I made or point something out, feel free to leave a comment below. Now I've taken the liberty of crossing out a lot of the weapons that simply aren't as practical on Venti, like getting kill stacks on the Black Cliff and shooting weak points for the prototype Crescent. To summarize, the Windblume at Refinement 5 basically does the same amount of damage as the Stringless at Refinement 1. The Stringless at Refinement 5 does about the same as the Skyward Harp at Refinement 1. And finally, the Skyward Harp at Refinement 5 does the most. However, the difference in damage between the Windblume at Refinement 5 versus the Skyward Harp at Refinement 1 is less than 7%. Because the difference in damage is actually quite small, I believe the main things to consider when choosing a weapon for Venti are actually based on availability and utility. So you can kind of ask yourselves the following questions. Do you have the Elegy for the End? Well, it's a great bow on Venti. It does good damage, has high energy regen, and it buffs the party. If you don't have the Elegy, do you want to milk out every last bit of damage from Venti's burst? Then I would consider the Skyward Harp or the Stringless. And the thing about the Stringless is that because it's at Refinement 1 and it does about the same amount of damage as the Windblume Ode, there's a good chance that in the future you will be getting more Stringlesses to refine. And next question is, would you prefer utility, for example more energy regen for higher burst uptime, or even some bonus energy for your entire team? Then the Favonius is a good choice. And as a side note, I've been using primarily the Favonius Warbow on Venti until very recently when I got the Elegy. So then the question is the Windblume ever a good choice? Well, if you don't have the aforementioned bows and you want to focus on damage, then the Windblume is a reasonable choice. One more thing to consider is the amount of resources that you may be able to save by enhancing the Windblume over the other bows. Compared to leveling a different 4-star bow to level 90, you end up saving around 200,000 Mora and 200 mystical enhancement ores. And assuming you're free to play, most free to play players actually have a lot of mystical enhancement ores, then you can assign a 0 resin value to them. So based on the Mora alone, you'd save only around 67 resin in total. Out of the total 512 resin, that includes farming for all the Ascension materials, as well as the Ascension Mora that you don't save on. But if you do highly value the 200 mystical enhancement ores, this can be worth considering. So my recommendation is, if you don't have a better damage dealing bow for Venti and you don't really need the utility from other bows like Elegy or Favonius, then I would consider this weapon. Really quickly for Fischl, she does gain the attack buff when she uses Oz, so this is good for her. Overall, assuming Fischl is proccing a lot of elemental reactions, which she generally does, these Venti weapon rankings are fairly similar for Fischl as well. Now let's take a look at this weapon on main DPS characters like Ganyu and Childe. For Ganyu, the only way for this bow to be remotely competitive is if you consistently use her for melt damage. Even then though, at Refinement 5, it's still worse than the Refinement 1 Prototype Crescent when its weak point buff is up. This is honestly a pretty bad weapon for Ganyu, and on top of this, Ganyu has a lot of downtime with the attack buff, since the attack buff lasts for 6 seconds and her skill has a 10-second cooldown. On top of this, you're going to need really good timing with your charge shots to squeeze 3 charge shots out during that 6-second buff window for the Windblume. Overall, this is not a great weapon for Melt Ganyu. I mean, it's usable, but I still wouldn't really recommend it. And instead, I would recommend the Prototype Crescent as a better free-to-play option. Now for Ganyu, if we look at freeze damage Ganyu, we can see that the Windblume Ode at Refinement 5 is really far down on this list. At this point, I would consider pretty much any of the other weapons above it over it, and you have a lot of different options when it comes to that. Next, let's take a quick look at Childe. Here's a quick comparison between the Windblume Ode versus the Skyward Harp. Now it is worth noting that the Windblume Ode did do more damage, but I had to fish for the crit a couple times, whereas the Skyward Harp had a much higher crit rate. Despite the fact that the Windblume did a bit more damage with its burst, when it came to the actual hydro damage from the melee attack, the Skyward Harp was still able to knock it out, I believe, just as fast or faster than the Windblume Ode, even though the Windblume Ode had bigger burst numbers. But anyway, let's take a look at this chart. This chart is for average vaporized burst numbers. So generally speaking, these sets have higher crit rates than usual compared to if you're going for big vape nukes. Many showcase videos have Childe as low as 15% crit rate when they go for the 1 million damage showcase videos. Anyway, since these are average crit numbers in this chart, we can see that the Windblume Ode performs much closer to the Skyward Harp for Childe than it does for Ganyu. This is because for Ganyu, the Amos bow and the Prototype Crescent really crank up Ganyu's damage in comparison to the Windblume Ode. And if you have the Amos bow, you're definitely going to use that, but if you have the Prototype Crescent, that is also a great free-to-play option for Ganyu. So once you remove those weapons out of the picture for a character like Childe, then the Windblume Ode is actually much more competitive of an option in comparison to the Skyward Harp for vaporized numbers. So if you are going for big vape numbers or even an electro-charged build with Childe, then the Windblume Ode is a fairly competitive option even to the Skyward Harp. But again, if you have the Skyward Harp, I would just use that over this. However, now let's take a look at the raw hydro damage, with a focus on his melee attacks outputting a lot of hydro damage. Now things are looking much more grim for the Windblume. Since I mostly play Childe by just simply using his raw hydro damage, there are so many better options for him compared to the Windblume Ode, and you really do fall far behind compared to the other weapons when you don't utilize the Elemental Mastery stat on the Windblume Ode. So in summary, when it comes to a main carry like Ganyu, unless you're using elemental reactions, which I would only really personally recommend Childe with his Electrocharge build due to its consistency and relatively universal usage, then I would actually consider the Windblume Ode, especially if you don't have the Skyward Harp. And again, when it comes to supports, I'm a firm believer that since the damage variance between the support bows is fairly small, I would pick based on availability and or your focus on utility and or your focus on min-maxing damage, and then kind of go down the list and pick the one that best suits your needs. That about wraps it up for my review of the Windblume Ode. Overall, I think it's a somewhat niche weapon that I recommend considering if you don't have any better options for the character in mind. As for why I leveled mine to level 90, well, it was entirely for this video. Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. These videos take a lot of research and math and also compiling a lot of clips and a lot of editing, so really appreciate it if you guys subscribed, liked, and commented. This is I Win to Lose, signing out.